order. So tonight, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Jonathan Bloom. And it's also a great pleasure for us hosting this launch, which was actually originally scheduled to take place tonight at the RAS in London. But now, because of COVID, we're doing it through Zoom, which in fact has enabled many more to attend and from all over the world. So some good things have come out of this very strange time that we are now in. Just to introduce a brief introduction to Jonathan. Jonathan was Norma Jean Calderwood Professor of Islamic and Asian Art at Boston College and held the Hamad bin Khalifa Chair of Islamic Art at Virginia Commonwealth University. He, for many of you, needs little introduction since you'll be very familiar with his numerous publications and articles on all aspects of Islamic art. And of course, this is his latest publication. And it's with great pleasure I'm going to hand over now to Jonathan to take us through architecture of the Islamic West. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Is that okay? Good. First, I must thank you and the Royal Asiatic Society for hosting this, along with Rosalind Haddon of the Islamic Art Circle for publicizing it, and also Charlotte Zaidi at Yale University Press for arranging, encouraging me to do this talk. As Alison said, I'd hoped to present it live in person, but even if I'd been able to travel with the region's recent surge in cases in America, I'd have to self-quarantine in Britain for 14 days. Fortunately, I'm speaking from relative isolation at our home in very rural New Hampshire. As Alison said, I'm here to talk about my new book, Architecture of the Islamic West, which has just been published. Unlike some other recent books you may have heard about, its contents weren't leaked to the press before publication, nor have I had any court orders to try and stop it. Perhaps people didn't think the topic was very exciting. I learned a lot while researching and writing the book, and I learned a lot more during the production, even though this is by far not my first book. For example, the press spent a great deal of time working on the cover. The design had to be readable when reduced to an icon in a catalog here. And so, got to get the right thing. And so, when it got small, you had to be able to recognize it. It's a lovely cover, but I really didn't think it was terribly exciting. And as Alison knows, I tried to liven it up a bit with this suggestion that might have sold a few more copies. But needless to say, we have the standard version. My interest in this region started in the 1970s when I had brown hair and I spent 6 months working on a Smithsonian project to study ancient Roman mosaics in Tunisia. And you see me standing in the museum in Sousse in Tunisia with a 10-centimeter square, trying to count the number of little mosaic tesserae in the 10 centimeters. That was my wonderful job to do. On the weekends, the project team would travel around Tunisia, which is an extraordinarily beautiful country, and looking at classical monuments and Islamic monuments. We traveled in an old Peugeot station wagon and got to such sites as Beitla, which was the ancient Safedla, and which I tried to take pictures of. And as you can see, I was not a very good photographer. In fact, I was awful. This is what the building is supposed to look like. We also went off to Islamic sites. And so we went several times to visit the great mosque at Kairouan, the Mosque of Sidi Oqba, which I also photographed at an angle and overexposed at the same time. After my time in Tunisia, I eventually returned to the States and began graduate studies in Islamic art. But I was disappointed that we spent so little time studying North Africa. I read, books such as Creswell, but there was very little written about North Africa, except in the very early period. And then I discovered this wonderful book by Georges Marseille on the Muslim architecture of the West, which he published in 1954 and was actually a reworking of a book that he had written in the 1920s. In 1977 and 78, I spent a year traveling around the Mediterranean doing research for my dissertation. And most of the time I was accompanied by my fellow graduate student, Sheila Blair, who you see here, who would soon become my wife and colleague. Everywhere we went, I lugged 25 pounds of camera equipment, including 2 bodies, 4 lenses, a flash, a tripod, and bags of film, Kodachrome, Ektachrome, and black and white film. And film was expensive for graduate students, so I didn't take as many pictures as I would later do when I had a digital camera. You had no idea whether your pictures would come out or not, and so many of the rolls that I brought home didn't turn out as well as I would like. Nevertheless, many of the pictures in the book were taken on that wonderful trip. After spending several months in Egypt, which was the focus of my research, we went on to spend a month in Tunisia, where there was a terrible coffee shortage, I remember, and you could only eat coffee, drink coffee made with a lot of roasted chickpeas. We then went on to Algeria, where there was lots of good coffee. And on our travels, we got to go to some pretty remote places, such as what you see here, the Cala of the Beni Hamad, which was a good day's drive south of Algiers. As graduate students without a car, we would have been totally unable to get there. It's not accessible by bus, for example, but we were able to go because the US consul in Algiers organized a trip with the ambassador because they were sort of stuck in Algiers and needed a good excuse to get out. And so they said they were going on a research trip with these 2 graduate students out to this remote site. So we spent a weekend driving there and back, and needless to say, stopping in various restaurants and interesting sites along the way. We also, Sheila and I also spent about a week in Tlemcen, which is very close to the Moroccan border in Algeria, because we couldn't find any place to stay in Algiers. We stayed in a hotel that was just above a bakery. And every morning we'd awaken to the smell of the freshly baked bread, which we then came downstairs and ate with lots of apricot jam and lots of coffee. It was a very, very pleasant time, even though I see it was raining a little bit that day. And here is the interior of this building, which is now was the local museum. We then went back to Algiers and then flew on to Casablanca in Morocco, because even though Tlemcen was very close to the border, my ticket from my fellowship insisted that I fly everywhere on American carriers or their equivalents. So we returned and then flew to Casablanca, and we got to a hotel in Casablanca, and Sheila, I remember, asked whether they had hot water, and the receptionist said yes, and cold water as well. They also had very good coffee too. We spent several weeks traveling around Morocco, photographing buildings, looking at sites. We went to Fez and Marrakesh and Rabat, where you see here the remains of the Almohad Mosque. And in the background, that little white building is the mausoleum of Mohammed V, who was the king of Morocco, who led it to independence, which is in a sort of Moroccan pastiche style designed by a French-Vietnamese architect, Kong Van Thuan. We then went on to Spain, and as we were poor students, we took the night train to Cordova from Madrid, and we arrived at the Great Mosque, which is now the Cathedral of Cordova, as early as we could in the morning. We entered along with the worshipers who were coming into the church for Mass. We were delighted to find ourselves the only visitors in the part that we were interested in, the mosque, But we were very disappointed to find that the glorious mihrab, which we only knew from picture books, actually looked like this. And then at like 9 o'clock, somebody turned on the lights, and they also started charging admission to the building for the tourists. We went on to Granada and went to visit, we went on to see the Alhambra in the cold and the rain, as you can see down at the bottom here, where the marble is all wet and slippery. We were so cheap that we didn't pay to take the bus up to the entrance. So we were exhausted. We walked up to the hilltop where the palace stands, and we were exhausted by the time we got to the entrance, particularly lugging all that heavy camera equipment. Anyway, went back to the States. I wrote my dissertation, which I finished in 1980, which was on Fatimid architecture. And it eventually came out as a book, also from Yale University Press, in 2007. So that was only 27 years between first draft and final version. In the following years, I began teaching and found that I couldn't teach North Africa, even though I was very interested in it, because there was nothing appropriate that was written in English. Occasionally, I got to travel to Morocco and Spain, Portugal, as accompanying tours of elderly tourists to the area, and of course got to travel in a much better style than we had as students. But of course you had to stay with the group. This was a very small group, a very, very small group, and we didn't, despite the fact that we're all smiling, I don't think we all got along terribly well. There was another tour which was much larger, where one of the clients had absolutely no interest in Moroccan art or culture, but she was interested in fashion. And that year, it turned out that the designer, Perry Ellis, had photographed his models in various locations in Marrakesh. And all this woman wanted was to find the exact location where every model had been photographed and do her own picture of the place. There was another client on another tour who came up to me after I'd prepared a sort of very, very carefully to talk about some buildings and other. And she said, "Jonathan, I know you're interested in art. I'm interested in shopping." So it was great when we could. You had to stay with the group most of the time, but it was great. Sometimes we were able to escape. And once we got away from the group and rented a Citroën deux chevaux, and went up into the high Atlas Mountains from Marrakesh, you can see it's early spring. The almond blossoms are just about coming out. And we drove up to see this very remote mosque, the Mosque of Tinmal. We got up there and discovered that the mosque was locked. There wasn't a person in sight. The place was totally abandoned. And we realized that everybody had left this little village to go to a neighboring village for some local festival. Having driven 3 hours up into the mountains, we were not about to be deterred. And Sheila suggested that we look, indeed, under one of the doors, there was enough space for us to squeeze through with a little help digging and get inside. And we spent several hours inside enjoying and studying the building. We returned 30 years later, and it had been restored, and much of the charm that I remembered from the original visit was lost. Similarly, in 2009, Sheila and I returned to the Alhambra, and it was the first time that we'd been there together since our student days. And this time we got to travel in style. Instead of trudging up the hill, a white Mercedes limousine took us up not only to the gate, but literally drove us past all the parking lots and stuff, right up to where you see this group of people standing in shadow in the front. And we were met by the chief guide who was assigned to take us around. And he thought he was getting assigned to some ignorant tourist, but he discovered that we actually knew a little something about Islamic art. And so he was very happy to spend most of the day with us. Instead of eating sandwiches, we went to the Alhambra Palace Hotel for lunch, which was something that we had never done as students. I have to say that, I don't think I would have appreciated all of this if I hadn't done it on the cheap as a student before. And then another time, I got to go to Granada in the spring when the wisteria was out. And I don't think I've ever seen so much beautiful wisteria. You can see some of it in the back on the right, below the Alhambra. And we had lunch at the University Faculty Club overlooking, and could you pay any attention to your meal if you had this exquisite view in front of you? I also, on that trip, I was given a special pass on a lanyard that allowed me to jump the line and enter and exit whenever I wanted the Alhambra, so I didn't have to deal with the tourists. This is the most popular, I believe, was until COVID, the most popular tourist attraction in Spain. So, in short, I've seen a lot of this area in very, very different circumstances. But I guess what you really are here or attending for is for me to talk about the book. I proposed the book, I thought about it, I've been thinking about it, as I said, for many, many years, but I formally proposed the book in 2014, so 6 years ago, to Jillian Malpass, who was then at Yale, and signed a contract the following June in 2015. And I said that I'd deliver a book with 90,000 words and 250 illustrations, of which 80 would be in color, by September of 2016. But I actually didn't deliver the book until January 2019, which I guess is somewhat better than the 27 years the Fatimid book took. I should also mention that I couldn't just write as much as I wanted and just hand it in. The press told me how long a book they would publish, and I had to fit what I wanted to say into it. When I finished my manuscript, it was somewhat longer than planned, but not too much. And I have to say, I had an absolutely wonderful team at Yale. In addition to Mark Eastman, who's the editorial director, Julie Hirschova managed the project, Linda Schofield edited the text, and Catherine Bankhurst designed the beautiful book that you will see. And of course, Nick Warner drew the wonderful plans, and at the last minute, Xavier Salmon at the Louvre offered to let me use some of his beautiful photographs of places that I couldn't enter, although the majority of the photographs are my own, with a few others supplied by very generous colleagues. The book begins with the earliest Islamic architecture in the region, in Tunisia. I'm not going to identify all these pictures. I just want you to enjoy them and see why I got excited about this project. I've got these are the mosques in Sousse and the minaret of the Great Mosque of Kairouan. Of course, in the second chapter, I discussed the contemporary buildings in Spain, Al-Andalus, with a very long discussion of the most famous monument, the Great Mosque of Cordova, which you see here with its artificial lighting. And it's a very spectacular dome, also mosaic over the mihrab area. I also talk about contemporary palaces in Spain and their survival. The next chapter, the third chapter, discusses various buildings from the 11th century that were built by a range of fairly more limited dynasties, and they range from a palace in Zaragoza in Spain, which you see on the left, to the minaret at the Cala of the Beni Hamad, which you saw before, in Algeria. There's a sort of section at the end which also deals with the slightly later but related architecture of Norman Sicily. This is sort of Islamicate architecture of Norman Sicily, such as the Ziza Palace, which you see on the left, and the ceiling of the Cappella Palatina in Palermo, which both of them are in Palermo. The Cappella Palatina, which just below where you see what you're looking at, just below the ceiling, there's a large image of Christ. But on the ceiling is perhaps the finest surviving example, is undoubtedly the finest surviving example of a wooden muqarnas ceiling. These stalactites that are characteristic of Islamic architecture and appear just at this period. Here, and then the fourth chapter deals with architecture under the successor dynasties, the Almoravids and the Almohads, roughly covering the period from about 1050 to 1250, which were two Berber dynasties that came to rule most of North Africa and southern Spain. On the left, there's the Maghreb area of the mosque at Tlemcen, where Sheila and I had visited in the 1970s. And on the right, the minaret, the very famous minaret of the Kutubiyya Mosque in Marrakesh. You'll notice up at the top that it's missing its tile decoration. If you go and see it today, all of the tile has been replaced. But you have no idea of how it was put up. It was nailed, actually. Some of the original tiles you could see on another side were nailed up to the top of the minaret. The fifth chapter of the book is devoted to the architecture of the Nasrid dynasty, in Al-Andalus, in Granada, roughly the period 1250 to 1500, and their signature building, the Alhambra Palace in Granada. Now, it is possible to write entire books about the Alhambra. And I had to try and condense it into something like one chapter alone. I hope that Allison has sent you the link that Yale has provided. If you want, you can read one chapter of this book if you're so interested. The chapter on the Alhambra online, and if not, I'm sure we can arrange to have it sent to you. As the Alhambra is so extraordinary that you could, as I said, you could write whole books. And I came up with this new word, Alhambrology, which I thought that sort of covers this sort of specialized study. But what I tried to do was put this extraordinary building into a larger context, the larger context of all the Islamic architecture in the Western Islamic lands. You could just have a great time looking at these gorgeous images. What was interesting is the Court of the Lions, which you see on the right. When Sheila and I first went there in the 70s, the courtyard was planted with grass. And in the when I went back in the 90s, it was gravel. And when we went back for our famous luxury trip, it was white marble. So, you start seeing that these timeless monuments are actually changing as scholars work on them. And it's difficult to know what is the most authentic aspect of these. I've used many of my photographs, I've chosen to use ones before the most recent restoration. And of course, the spectacular muqarnas domes in the Palace of the Lions at the Alhambra. And for those of you who are worried about your gardens, there are always the gardens of the Generalife adjacent to the Alhambra, which are extraordinary and evocative. The next chapter, chapter 6, turns to contemporary buildings in the same period, roughly 1250 to 1500 in North Africa, under various dynasties that succeeded the great Berber dynasties, the Almohads in there. And they were in basically you start getting the division that we see today between what roughly Algeria, roughly Morocco, and roughly Tunisia. These are some of the most beautiful buildings. They're certainly the ones in Morocco share many of the decorative features that one sees in contemporary buildings in Spain, notably the Alhambra. But the buildings in Algeria, and some of them are related to the same thing, but the ones in Tunisia are quite different and not terribly well known, and reflect a slightly different past, much more use of stone and arches. So I've tried to show all these different aspects coming together. I then realizing that I one had to keep going with the story, the 7th chapter covers buildings built in the period 1500 to 1800, when North Africa was caught between the Habsburgs, who were ruling in Europe, and the Ottomans, who were ruling in the Eastern Mediterranean. And I really knew, before I started this project, I really knew nothing about it. And I came to be fascinated by this period, because you can see here in Tunis on the left and in Algiers on the right, these are two mosques that are built in the, quote, Ottoman, unquote, style. They don't look to us, they don't really look anything like an Ottoman mosque, but this is what locals did, and because the Ottomans were extending their power and rule over cities such as Tunis and Algiers. For some of these buildings, of course, some of them I visited, some of them I also was able to find historic photographs, particularly at the Library of Congress and other public institutions. I should say that one of the extraordinary things and changes in writing this book is how much material has been available online that I've been able to find just sitting at my desk in New Hampshire, and access to journals from Tunisia and Morocco, collections in the French archives. And here, these are two photographs from the Library of Congress. This shows the interior of what was called the New Mosque, or the Mosque of the Fishermen, in Algiers. And on the right is the courtyard of the Dar Aziza, which was a part of the royal palace in Algiers, which was then converted into the Archbishop's residence. And so it's identified in the photograph in the Library of Congress as the Archbishop's residence. Another interesting document I was able to find, this is a set of plans that shows how the French colonizers transformed the Kachawa Mosque, which you see on the left, the smallest item, into the Cathedral of Saint-Philippe after the conquest of Algeria in 1830. And they took the original mosque, and actually it morphed into this cathedral. The mihrab, as you can probably see, is pointing at the bottom, and then the apse in the cathedral, of course, is pointing in the opposite direction. What's sort of ironic is after Algerian independence in 1962, the cathedral was transformed back into the Kechawa Mosque. And so, you know, tit for tat. The 8th chapter looks at the contemporary period in Morocco, 1500 to 1800, which under 2 dynasties, the Saadians and the Alawis, who continue to rule to this day. And one of the major features that I talk about is this enormous palace, the Badia Palace in Marrakesh, which is semi-ruined. But in doing research for the book, I was delighted to discover a plan of the palace by a 16th century Portuguese priest who went to Marrakesh to try and ransom some sailors who'd been captured and enslaved by the Moroccan Sultan. And the Mosque of the Kasbah, which I discuss in the book, is located in the upper right of the plan, not quite, the upper left of the plan, not quite at the top. And the palace that you just saw is located, is here in this image with the courtyard in green and with the 4 pools in the side and then pavilions at either end. So he was able to get, this priest was able to get a very good view. And we also have in the book another plan of the palace that was done by, I believe, a Dutchman who went there. The last chapter looks at how this architecture was viewed and appropriated by Europeans in the 18th and 19th centuries. I think when, you know, I started studying Islamic art, no one paid too much attention to the 18th and 19th centuries. I've learned that this is really very important, you know, to think about how we know what we know today and why we know it. And so here you have some representations of various aspects of mosques and minarets in Tunis, Algiers, and Annaba from a French publication. And on the right, the Alhambra Court from the great exhibition in London, the Crystal Palace. But, you know, to keep the story going, I've continued with some contemporary buildings, such as on the left, you can see the historicizing mosque of Mohammed V at Casablanca, which sort of looks like a cargo ship that's pulled up against the seashore, or this modernist, totally modernist Jama al-Jazair in Algiers, which is still under construction, I believe, which will have an enormous shopping mall attached to it. And I was very grateful to get this wonderful photograph by an Algerian photographer, Zainuddin Savar. So if you find all of this at all interesting, as Alison said at the beginning, you can order the book through the Yale website with the special discount. You can read a sample chapter. And, you know, in these times of restricted travel, it can take you to different times and places. And I promise you that it has absolutely nothing to do with COVID-19 or the activities of Boris Johnson, Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, or Xi Jinping. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. That was wonderful. I'm just sorry that you couldn't hear our reactions, that we're not able to laugh at, you know, the lovely pictures that you showed us of the dancing lady, etc. Now, I just wondered if anybody has any questions, but I'll start off with a question. You mentioned at the beginning, you know, that when you started on this quest in the 1980s, there was very little, well, not a great deal of interest or scholarly interest, if you like, in the architecture of North Africa. And do you think that's changing and people are becoming more interested in studying it in more depth?
Well, funny you should mention this, because I believe one of the attendees listening to this is Khorasan Fenech, who has just written an absolutely splendid book on the archaeology of early North Africa, early Islamic North Africa. And, you know, I immediately wrote to her and I said, you know, it's too bad. I should have known about this, what your book, when I was writing mine. So yes, there is increasing interest, and I think that I hope those of you who teach will be tempted to, you know, perhaps offer a course on North Africa now that there is this material that's available.
I think James Nobles would like to ask a question. James from Beijing. So
good morning. Good morning, Professor.
Good morning.
Yes. Really quick question. I'm not going to turn on my video because it's dark here. Really quick question. You showed the plans of the mosque that was later turned into a cathedral and then turned back into a mosque.
Right.
The question I had was, in the diagram it showed the Qibla, or the point that usually always faces towards Mecca.
Yeah.
But it showed it opposite of where the nave was, and I was a little confused because usually naves are also facing east. You would have thought they would have oriented both the Qibla and the nave in the same direction.
Right. You know, I think it had to do with the topography of the site. Actually, not all churches are face east. They're not always oriented. Sometimes they're occidented.
True.
So you know, I think it had to do with the orientation. Though when I did look for photographs of the interior of this mosque, of this cathedral, as turned into a church, back into a mosque, that they had put the mihrab at the correct end. Though I should say that has nothing to, the Qibla, the direction of Mecca, is not exactly that. You know, it's not an accurate, quote, modern scientific accurate Qibla direction.
Mm-hmm.
They just, you know, it's what you believe this is appropriate.
All right, thank you very much.
Basically, we have a question from Musna asking you, Jonathan, where you felt the most content with from all these glorious buildings. Is there one in particular
that I liked the most?
Yes. And Valerie Hansen also has a similar question, in the place that you liked the best. All right. So.
Oh, well, I would say that, can I go back? I don't know whether it's not allowing, for some reason it's frozen.
Yes.
But my screen is, I don't know why, because I would say that there are places like Shella in Morocco that are outside of Rabat, which is one of the most romantically beautiful spots. It's sort of this ruined enclosure. I mean, very large. It was once virtually a town size, but it's filled with gardens that cascade down to the water, the river below, and with a minaret where there are always storks nesting on the top, and it's just, you know, beautiful plants, beautiful flowers, interesting buildings. It's lovely. You know, because I went to Tunisia first, I have a very warm spot in my heart for everything Tunisian. So it's hard to choose. You know, it's sort of like asking a parent, which of your children do you love the most?
Okay, thank you. A very difficult question. So we have one more question. I'm afraid the only name that we have is iPad, and we can unmute you, iPad, if you'd like to go ahead and speak to Jonathan directly.
Go.
Hello, yes. I would just like,
Introduce
I'm Shrimanti Datta. I would like to know that what do you think, what are the main differences between this Islamic art in North Africa and Spain and say India and Central Asia? How would you explain the differences? What is your view?
Right. Well, I mean, there are many. I think that I think the most important one is how interiorizing, is that a word? How turned inward this architecture is. That, you know, it's not terribly impressive from the outside. And, you know, when you think about something like the Taj Mahal, it's incredibly impressive from the outside, and it's not all that impressive inside. You're meant to see it from the outside more than the inside. And you could say that, you know, of the buildings in Central Asia, some of the great Timurid buildings in Central Asia, they glitter on the outside, or certainly, and they were meant to originally glitter on the outside. And this architecture is much more turned inward. And whether this is a holdover from early Islamic times, I'm not sure. It's also structurally less inventive. That is, it doesn't really use domes the way Ottoman architecture does, or Persian architecture. It doesn't use a lot of vaulting the way Persian architecture does. And one of the reasons has to do with geography. That is, almost in all places, with probably the exception of Tunisia, but even that, there were lots of forests, and there was plenty of timber available. So people could make timber roofs rather than having to use vaulting, brick vaulting and stone vaulting to cover enormous spaces. So that's a different, and the sort of all of the oomph is concentrated, I would say, on the interiors of the buildings. So those are some of the major differences I see.
Thank you.
Well, we have another question from David Wasserstein. Could you tell us something about the source of the wonderful plan on pages 244 and 258, the 16th century plan of the Marrakesh Palace? He makes a comment. It seems to be in a Slavonic script or language.
No, it's Portuguese, and it is from the Escorial. And I have to say, you know, one of the wonders of modern scholarship, I wrote to like general information at the Escorial and said, by any chance, might I be able to get a photograph of this plan that I read about in a book? And David, I'll be very happy to give you the details of the publication of this plan, which was done in the 1930s, I believe. And the Escorial, by basically return email, sent me a godzillion megabyte file of the plan and said, publish it with our blessing. So that's where it comes from.
And thank you. And I have another question from Hugh Kennedy, asking if you discuss buildings like the Alcazar in Seville, built by Christian patrons in the Muslim style. Absolutely,
I do. Yes, I have included that. And, you know, I tried to show as many different kinds of examples because of the limitation of length and pictures. I mean, as it turned out, the balance was reversed, and there are many more color pictures than black and whites. But I do discuss the Alcazar and how this, I try and discuss whether whether we should think of this as Islamic art or rather as expensive art. And it really didn't matter whether you're a Muslim or a Christian. And the same decorators, in effect, were working at the Alhambra and at the Alcazar in Seville because it was a shared taste of rich people.
Great, thank you. And we have questions on a similar theme, phrased in a very similar way, is what do you feel are the main architectural differences between the Fatimid monuments of Cairo and North Africa? And 3 people have asked about that.
Between Fatimid North Africa and
Fatimid monuments of North Africa and Egypt. Sorry,
right.
in the Fatimid monuments of North Africa and Egypt.
I mean, I think that they went in very different directions. That one of the, perhaps it's a reflection of my experience, but the heritage of the legacy of Rome and Roman buildings in Tunisia is absolutely extraordinary. And that these were known certainly known and seen in the Middle Ages, and their columns were reused in buildings. That's much less so of course, in Egypt. Yes, indeed, there are ancient columns that are reused to support Al-Azhar, the mosque in Cairo, but that architecture in Egypt went off in a very different direction. There were some ideas that seem to have been shared. General organization of a mosque, for example, of the Fatimid mosque seems to come with the Fatimids from Tunisia. But I don't really think that too many workmen, builders, since I've moved with the Fatimids from North Africa to Egypt, and that it was much more likely that the builders were either Egyptians or came from Syria. The stonemasons came from Syria and places like that.
Mm. Right, thank you. I think we'll just go for the last question, because I think you must be feeling a bit exhausted, sort of just talking into the screen. This one is from Daoud Murtaza, who said he loved your photographs and wondered if you could shed some light on your approaches to photography. To what extent do you plan your trips to get the right photos in the right light? And he makes a comment, typically it gets quite overwhelming and time-consuming balancing study and photography. You seem to have found the perfect balance to manage both aspects together. Can you speak about that a bit?
Well, thank you very much. But I tell you, it's more accidental than a plan. First of all, I would say the best thing, the most important thing is to take lots of pictures and discard all the bad ones. So, I can't tell you how many bad pictures there are. And, this does represent decades of work. I have absolutely no professional experience as a photographer. I never took a course in photography. I just learned by doing. I do have somewhat of a background in the visual arts. So, I think the compositions are good, or can be good, but I have to say it's mostly accidental. I tend to like, a lot of architectural photographers tend to like to take pictures without people in them. And since I believe that buildings are inhabited by people, or made for people, I think it's really good to have people in buildings that show, in photographs, that show, give a sense of scale, because otherwise you have no idea how people fit into the buildings. So that's how I do it, and hope for the best. And all I can say is that I'm often at place at the wrong time of day, because you only have one day to be there, and it was morning or afternoon, and you should have been there at some other time. So I try my best.
Well, I think you do very well. So thank you very much, Jonathan. And
thank you, Alison.
A wonderful launch. We'll all have to start getting used to just talking into these screens. So I'm really very sorry that I can't offer you some refreshment at this point and carry you off to dinner to celebrate the launch of this.
Well, let us hope we can do it some other time in the future.
Yeah, exactly. This is not instead of, it's in addition to. Right?
And I hope all of you who are listening, wherever you are around the world, stay safe, stay healthy. And I hope we actually get to shake hands or hug sometime in the future.
Yes. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending.
Thank you.
We will be having more lectures and more launches coming up through the summer. So stay in touch. And again, thank you. And as Jonathan said, stay safe and stay well. Thank you very much.